Most people are afraid of losing money, but there is something even more terrifying: losing everything. Your savings, your security, your future, your home, the place your family depends on, the place where your children sleep at night, the place you spent years working to afford. Now imagine willingly putting all of that at risk, not because you have a guaranteed opportunity waiting for you, not because investors are lining up to write checks, not because success is already within reach, but because you believe in an idea that nobody else can see, an idea that exists only in your mind, an idea that might completely change your life or destroy it. That's exactly what Daniel Carter did. The day he signed the mortgage papers, he wasn't sitting on a billion-dollar business. He wasn't a successful entrepreneur. He wasn't famous. He was an ordinary man with a dream, a family, and more uncertainty than answers. And yet he decided to bet the most valuable thing he owned on an idea that had never been tested. When he told people what he was about to do, the reaction was immediate. Friends warned him. Co-workers thought he was making a terrible mistake. Family members begged him to reconsider. Bankers questioned his judgment, and some people didn't even try to hide what they thought. They laughed. To them, it looked like a disaster waiting to happen. A man risking everything for a dream that would probably never work. After all, most businesses fail. Most entrepreneurs lose money, and most people who mortgage their homes don't become success stories. They become cautionary tales. Daniel understood that. He knew the odds. He knew exactly what he could lose, but he also knew something else. Sometimes the biggest risk isn't taking a chance. It's spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you had. What nobody knew at the time was that the decision everyone considered reckless would eventually transform Daniel into one of the most successful entrepreneurs in his industry. Years later, those same people would tell a very different story. The friends who warned him, the relatives who doubted him, the people who laughed because the man they once called crazy had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. This is his story. Daniel Carter wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't the son of a successful entrepreneur. He didn't grow up around venture capital, startups, or business empires. There were no wealthy investors in the family. No trust funds, no shortcuts. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood where financial stability was considered the ultimate goal. Get a good job, buy a house, provide for your family, avoid unnecessary risks. That was the formula, and for most people around him, it worked. For many years, Daniel followed that same path. He studied hard, graduated from college, found a stable job in the home improvement industry. The pay was decent, the benefits were good, the future looked predictable. On paper, he was doing everything right, the kind of life his parents had hoped he would build, the kind of life many people spend years trying to achieve. But there was a problem. Daniel hated predictable, not because he disliked stability, because he couldn't stop noticing problems. Every day he saw things that didn't make sense. Customers waiting too long for basic services, contractors struggling to find reliable suppliers, orders arriving late, projects running over budget, businesses relying on outdated systems that wasted both time and money. Most people accepted these frustrations as part of the industry. Daniel couldn't. Every problem felt like a question waiting to be answered. Every inefficiency felt like an opportunity. At first, he ignored those observations. Then he started writing them down. Small notes, ideas scribbled on napkins, thoughts typed into his phone during lunch breaks. Patterns began to emerge. The same complaints appeared again and again, the same frustrations, the same bottlenecks, the same inefficiencies. Months turned into years, and what started as curiosity slowly became obsession. He spent evenings researching the industry, weekends studying competitors, late nights sketching solutions nobody had asked him to create. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the entire system was outdated, and if it was outdated, someone would eventually replace it. The question that kept him awake at night was simple. Why couldn't that person be him? Eventually, Daniel stopped asking whether the opportunity existed. He started asking whether he had the courage to pursue it. One evening, after weeks of rehearsing the conversation in his head, Daniel sat down at the kitchen table with his wife. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep. He explained the problem he had been studying, the opportunity he believed everyone else was missing, a platform that would connect suppliers, contractors, and customers more efficiently than anyone else in the market. A solution that could save businesses time, money, and eliminate the frustrations that had plagued the industry for years. As he spoke, his excitement grew. But so did the weight of what he was proposing, because building the company would require money. A lot more money than he had. The room went silent. Then Daniel revealed the part he had been dreading. He didn't have enough savings to launch the business, not even close, which meant there was only one realistic option left. The family home, the house they had worked years to buy. The house where they were building their future. Daniel wanted to mortgage it, and in that moment the dream stopped being a dream. It became a gamble, one that could either change their lives forever or cost them everything. The reaction was immediate. Friends told him not to do it. Co-workers said he was making a huge mistake. Even relatives questioned his judgment. One family member looked him in the eye and said, "You're gambling your children's future." That sentence stayed with him, not because it was cruel, because it reflected exactly what everyone else was thinking, and deep down part of him was thinking it too. The day he signed the mortgage documents, the reality of what he was doing hit him harder than expected. The signatures took only a few seconds, but the consequences could last for years. As he walked out of the bank, he sat in his car for several minutes without starting the engine. For the first time, there was no turning back. The money was committed. The decision was real. And now, the clock was ticking. Every dollar spent increased the pressure. Every delayed milestone increased the pressure. Every month without meaningful revenue made the situation more frightening. There were nights when Daniel couldn't sleep, nights when he would wake up at 3 in the morning and stare at the ceiling. Running numbers through his head, calculating expenses, estimating how long they could survive if things didn't improve. One particularly difficult month, after losing a potential customer he had spent weeks trying to secure, Daniel drove home in complete silence. He parked in the driveway and looked at the house he had placed on the line, the house where his family lived, the house everyone said he was risking, and for a moment fear took over, not fear of failing, fear of dragging the people he loved down with him. That fear was heavier than any financial risk. He sat there for nearly 20 minutes, thinking, questioning, wondering if it was time to quit before things became worse. But every time he considered walking away, the same thought returned. The problem still existed. The inefficiencies were still there, the opportunity was still there, and nobody else seemed interested in solving it. That belief became the fuel that kept him moving, through the uncertainty, through the criticism, through the sleepless nights, through the fear, even when the numbers looked bad, even when logic suggested he should stop, because while everyone else saw a reckless gamble, Daniel saw an opportunity, and he was willing to risk everything to prove he was right. Before we continue, I want you to think about something. Have you ever believed in something that everyone else doubted? An idea, a goal, a dream? Something that made perfect sense to you, but seemed completely impossible to everyone around you? Because that's exactly where Daniel is right now. He's already put his house on the line. He's already walked away from security, and so far he has nothing to show for it except pressure, uncertainty, and a growing list of people telling him he made a mistake. The easy choice would be to quit. The safe choice would be to quit. But what Daniel does next is the reason we're telling this story. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and let's see what happened when Daniel decided to keep going. Starting the company was difficult. Keeping it alive was even harder. The first year was brutal, far more difficult than Daniel had imagined. Customers were slow to arrive. Revenue barely covered expenses. Some months it didn't cover them at all. The platform worked. The problem was real, but convincing people to change their habits proved much harder than building the solution itself. Potential customers liked the idea. They praised the concept. Then they went back to doing things the way they always had. Daniel heard the same phrase over and over again. "We'll think about it." Most never called back. Meanwhile, Daniel worked 18-hour days. He handled customer support, sales, marketing, operations, product development, technical issues, anything that needed to be done. The pressure never stopped. Then came the worst moment. A major supplier pulled out of a partnership agreement just days before launch. Months of work disappeared overnight. Contracts had to be rewritten. Plans had to be abandoned. Timelines collapsed. That night he sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The building was silent. The computer screen glowed in front of him. He opened a spreadsheet and calculated exactly how much runway remained. The answer was terrifying. If things didn't improve within 60 days, the money would run out. And when the money ran out, it wouldn't just be the business that suffered. His home was tied to this decision. His family's future was tied to this decision. For the first time, since starting the company, he seriously considered quitting. Not because he stopped believing in the idea, because he was exhausted from carrying the weight alone. He stared at the wall for what felt like hours. Then he did something unexpected. He opened a blank document and started writing. Not a resignation letter. Their plan, every supplier he hadn't contacted yet, every customer he hadn't followed up with, every option he hadn't fully explored. It took him until 2 in the morning, but by the time he finished, the panic had transformed into something else. Clarity. The next morning he came back and started over. He contacted new suppliers, reworked the platform, made hundreds of calls, searched for solutions where everyone else saw dead ends. Progress was slow, painfully slow, but it was progress. 1 customer became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 10. And for the first time in a long time, the business wasn't moving backward. It was moving forward. The moment everything changed arrived in the most unexpected way. Daniel had been trying to land a meeting with the operations manager of a regional construction company for 4 months. 4 months of emails, voicemails, polite rejections from assistants, 1 cancelled meeting, 1 no-show. He almost stopped trying, but he sent 1 final email, 3 sentences. No pitch, no attachments, just a direct question. "Can I have 15 minutes to show you something specific to your supply chain?" The manager replied within the hour. 15 minutes turned into 90. By the end of the meeting, the manager leaned back in his chair and said something Daniel had waited years to hear. "We've been dealing with this exact problem for 6 years. Nobody has ever come in here with an actual solution." The contract was signed 2 weeks later. It wasn't enormous, but it was real, and more importantly, it was proof. Within weeks, the contractor started talking about the platform to others in the industry. Referrals arrived, then more referrals. People trusted recommendations from other business owners more than any advertisement. And for the first time, Daniel's company was benefiting from something money couldn't buy: credibility. The conversations that had been so difficult for years suddenly became easier. Potential customers were no longer asking, "Who are you?" Now they were asking, "Can you show us how this works?" That single shift altered everything. Contracts increased, revenue climbed. The company hired its first employees, then entire teams. Partnerships followed. Larger businesses joined the platform. Major suppliers began paying attention. Organizations that had previously ignored Daniel suddenly wanted meetings. And investors who had once refused to return his calls were now requesting appointments. The entrepreneur people once laughed at was becoming one of the most talked about founders in the industry. Competitors finally noticed too. But by then, it was too late. The small company they had ignored had become a serious threat, and the same people who once questioned Daniel's sanity began asking a very different question. "How did you know it would work?" Daniel always gave a similar answer. He didn't know. He didn't have certainty. He didn't have guarantees. He had doubts. He had fears. He had sleepless nights just like everyone else. The difference wasn't that he knew he would succeed. The difference was that he was willing to try despite not knowing. 10 years after mortgaging his home, Daniel Carter stood on a stage looking out at an audience that seemed impossible to imagine a decade earlier. Employees, investors, business leaders, partners. Behind him, a giant screen displayed another record year. The company had grown beyond anything he once imagined. Hundreds of employees, thousands of customers, operations across multiple countries, a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But whenever journalists asked Daniel about the valuation, he rarely seemed interested in discussing the number. Because to him, the valuation wasn't the story. The story was everything that happened before it. The sleepless nights, the uncertainty, the fear. The moment he sat alone in that office until 2 in the morning, writing a plan instead of a resignation letter. Those were the moments that mattered, because success wasn't created the day the company became profitable. It was created the moment he decided to bet on himself, the moment he accepted uncertainty instead of waiting for guarantees that would never arrive. Most people spend years waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for complete confidence, waiting until the risk disappears. But by the time risk disappears, the opportunity often disappears with it. Daniel eventually realized something powerful. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to move forward despite fear. He had been afraid many times, afraid when he signed the mortgage papers, afraid when customers weren't showing up, afraid when the company nearly ran out of money, afraid when the partnership collapsed and he sat alone staring at a spreadsheet at midnight. The difference was that he kept moving anyway, and over time, those small steps became momentum. That momentum became growth, and that growth became a company nobody could ignore. The friends who warned him eventually changed their minds. The relatives who doubted him eventually changed their minds. The people who laughed eventually stopped. Not because Daniel argued with them, not because he tried to prove them wrong, because results have a way of ending arguments. But maybe the most surprising part of the story is this. Daniel never seemed angry at the people who doubted him. He understood them, because if he had been standing on the outside looking in, he probably would have had doubts too. After all, the decision looked irrational. It looked reckless. It looked dangerous, and maybe it was. But sometimes the biggest opportunities arrive disguised as terrible ideas. And when Daniel looks back on that moment now, he doesn't remember the valuation. He doesn't remember the headlines. He remembers sitting at the kitchen table with his wife, the house quiet, the kids asleep, and the moment he decided to bet on himself, because that was the moment everything truly began. 10 years earlier, Daniel sat in his driveway staring at the house he might lose. 10 years later, he stood on a stage looking at a company he almost never built. The difference between those two moments was a decision to keep going one more day, then one more, until the impossible became reality and nobody was laughing anymore. Daniel's story isn't really about mortgaging a house. It's about what happens when you believe in something before anyone else does. The people around you will always see the risk first. They'll see what could go wrong, what you could lose, what the statistics say. But they can't see what you see. They can't see the opportunity keeping you awake at night. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that vision you're carrying is the most valuable thing you own. More valuable than the house. More valuable than the security. More valuable than the approval of people who are afraid to take the same chance. Subscribe to Profit and Peril for more stories like this one, and leave a comment. What's the biggest bet you've ever made on yourself? I read every single one. We'll be back tomorrow with another incredible story.